What if everything you believed about Roman hygiene was wrong? What if the greatest empire in human history, famous for its aqueducts, its bathhouses, its monumental sewers, actually made people sicker than they were before? What if the very laws designed to clean the streets ended up poisoning the food? And what if the city of Jerusalem, sacred to millions, was quietly drowning in its own waste long before its walls ever fell to siege? What if the truth about daily life in this ancient city is something no one wants to imagine? You are about to find out. By the end of this documentary, you will understand what it truly meant to survive in a city where water was sacred, filth was invisible, and the line between civilization and disease was thinner than anyone dared to admit. Close your eyes for a moment and picture Jerusalem in the first century. Not the golden city of psalms and prayers, not the gleaming temple that caught the morning sun and blinded travelers approaching from the east. Picture instead the narrow alleys of the lower city, where the air hangs thick with smoke from cooking fires, where the sharp smell of animal dung mixes with the sweetness of rotting fruit, where a thin stream of greyish water trickles down a central channel carved into the limestone street. You step carefully. The stones beneath your sandals are slick. Something dark pools near the wall of a house. You do not look down. Jerusalem in the age of Roman rule was a city of contradictions, its population swelling to perhaps 30,000 residents and multiplying several times over during the great pilgrimage festivals of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, generated an enormous volume of human waste that the city had no comprehensive system to manage. The ancient Gihon Spring, which had sustained the settlement since the time of King David 1,000 years earlier, was hopelessly insufficient for a city of this size. Rainwater was the primary source of water for most households. Archaeologists have found that nearly every residence in ancient Jerusalem had at least one cistern carved into the soft limestone bedrock, collecting rain that ran off rooftops during the wet season. The scholar Edward Robinson noted in the 19th century that the domestic cisterns in Jerusalem were innumerable, and that no house was ever built without one. But cisterns are stagnant. They do not flow. Whatever falls in stays in, including dust, insects, bird droppings, and the invisible organisms that breed in still water. The Romans, to their credit, recognized the problem. Pontius Pilate himself, the governor remembered by history for an entirely different decision, commissioned the construction of an aqueduct to bring water into the city from sources near Bethlehem, roughly 40 kilometers away. The Beer Aqueduct, as archaeologists now call part of this system, was among the most sophisticated water engineering projects in the region. A 2021 study by researchers from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem confirmed through carbon-14 dating that this underground tunnel was likely built during Pilate's governorship, between 26 and 36 of the Common Era. The engineering was remarkable. The tunnel incorporated methods described in the writings of the Roman architect Vitruvius, mixing spring water with groundwater to multiply the volume by as much as 7 times. But this impressive feat of engineering came at a terrible political cost. According to the historian Josephus, Pilate funded the construction by raiding the temple treasury, the sacred fund known as the Korban. When the people of Jerusalem discovered what had happened, tens of thousands gathered in protest. Pilate, anticipating the unrest, had already planted soldiers disguised in civilian clothing throughout the crowd. These were not Roman-born legionaries. They were auxiliary troops, likely Samaritans from a locally recruited cohort, men who could blend seamlessly among Jewish faces. They carried concealed clubs beneath their cloaks. On Pilate's signal from his tribunal, they attacked. Many were beaten to death. Others were trampled in the stampede that followed. The water that was supposed to save the city arrived drenched in blood. And yet even this aqueduct, with all its engineering brilliance, fed into a system that was fundamentally limited. The water flowed first to Solomon's pools, 3 massive reservoirs near Bethlehem with a combined capacity of over 250,000 cubic meters, roughly the surface area of 4 football fields. From there, 2 aqueducts carried the water northward to Jerusalem. The lower aqueduct crossed the valley of Hinnom, wound along the southern slope of Mount Zion, and entered the city near what is now the Jewish quarter, eventually reaching the Temple Mount through an underground passage supported by what is known today as Wilson's Arch. But the journey was long, the channels were open in certain stretches, and contamination along the way was inevitable. The water that arrived in Jerusalem was not the pristine spring water that left the hills of Bethlehem. It carried with it the sediment, the organic matter, and the microscopic passengers that would quietly reshape the health of an entire population. You stand at the edge of the pool of Siloam, where water collects after its long journey through Hezekiah's ancient tunnel. The surface is calm. Children splash near the shallow edges. Women fill clay jars and balance them on their heads for the walk home. The water looks clean enough, but beneath that calm surface, invisible to every eye in the 1st century, organisms are already multiplying. Giardia duodenalis, a parasite that causes violent dysentery, cramping and dehydration, has been positively identified in ancient Jerusalem through advanced biomolecular analysis. Researchers from the University of Cambridge used a technique called ELISA, which employs antibodies to detect the presence of single-celled organisms that are too fragile to survive as visible fossils, and confirmed that Giardia was present in the cesspits beneath ancient toilet seats found in the city of David. Because Giardia spreads through contaminated water and sometimes through flies, the lead researcher, Piers Mitchell, concluded that this parasite was probably widespread throughout the entire ancient city. This was not a rare infection. This was the water everyone drank. Confira-se já é inscrito neste canal. Every week, we uncover the hidden truths behind the ancient world that most documentaries will never show you. Subscribe now so you never miss a revelation. Now let us descend beneath the streets. Let us leave the sunlit courtyards and the market stalls behind and look at what the residents of Jerusalem tried hardest to ignore. The infrastructure below the houses, the cesspits, the places where the reality of being human in a city without plumbing became impossible to escape. In ancient Jerusalem, a private toilet was a luxury reserved exclusively for the wealthiest families. Archaeological excavations in the city of David, the oldest core of the settlement just south of the Temple Mount, have uncovered only a handful of stone toilet seats in their original positions, each placed over a deep cesspit carved into the bedrock. The most famous of these was found in what archaeologists call the House of Ahiel, a typical 4-room Israelite dwelling from the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era. The limestone seat, roughly rectangular with a smooth central opening, sat in a small room at the back of the house. Beneath it, a pit collected everything. In 2022, Dr. Daphna Langut of Tel Aviv University published a remarkable study on sediment recovered from beneath a similar toilet seat at a site called Armon Hanatziv, a lavish estate in southern Jerusalem dating to the mid-7th century before the Common Era. Her team found the preserved eggs of 4 distinct species of intestinal parasites: roundworm, whipworm, beef or pork tapeworm, and pinworm. These eggs, protected by the unique conditions of the sealed cesspit, had survived for nearly 2,700 years. What they revealed was devastating. Even the wealthiest residents of Jerusalem, the only people who could afford a private toilet, were riddled with parasitic infections. The existence of an indoor toilet was not a marker of better health. It was merely a matter of convenience. For the vast majority of the population, there were no private toilets at all. Most people used chamber pots, which had to be emptied somewhere. In Roman cities across the empire, the common practice was to dump the contents out of upper-story windows onto the streets below. The Roman jurist Ulpian actually wrote advisory opinions on how to seek legal compensation for being doused by waste thrown from above, suggesting this was far from an uncommon occurrence. In Jerusalem's densely packed lower city, where multi-story stone dwellings crowded together along winding streets barely wide enough for two donkeys to pass, the situation was no different. The streets themselves became the default sewage system. Whatever was dumped eventually trickled downhill, following the natural gradient toward the Kidron Valley to the east or the Hinnom Valley to the south. The Valley of Hinnom, that deep, narrow ravine curving along the southern and western edges of the old city, carried a weight far heavier than geography. In centuries past, it had been the site of child sacrifices to the god Molech, a history so dark that the prophet Jeremiah had cursed it as a valley of slaughter. By the 1st century, the valley's association with defilement was so deeply embedded in the collective memory that its very name, Gehinnom, became the Hebrew word later transliterated into Greek as Gehenna, the term Jesus himself used when speaking of a place of ultimate destruction. Archaeological evidence from the area includes enormous deposits of pottery shards, ash, animal bones, and household debris on the southeastern slopes. Sewer channels built beneath the streets of Jerusalem drained through the city gates and emptied into this valley. The waste of an entire city, the organic refuse of tens of thousands of lives, flowed toward a place already synonymous with abomination. What strikes you as you imagine walking those streets is the smell. There is no modern equivalent for the sensory assault of a first-century city in the Mediterranean summer. No garbage collection, no sealed drains, no chemical disinfectants. The temperature pushes past 35 degrees Celsius. Flies swarm over every surface where organic matter has settled. The odor is not a single note. It is layered. There is the sharp ammonia of urine soaking into limestone. There is the thick, sweet decay of food waste rotting in the heat. There is the metallic tang of blood from the nearby temple sacrifices where thousands of animals were slaughtered during festival periods, their blood running through channels that ultimately fed into the same drainage system as everything else. Ancient Israelites used perfume, incense, and bundles of aromatic spices in nearly every aspect of daily life. This was not mere vanity. It was survival. The air had to be masked to be endured, and yet people lived. They raised families, they cooked meals and celebrated weddings and argued with their neighbors and worshipped their God and carried on day after day in conditions that would shut down a modern city within hours. There is something in that endurance that deserves more than pity. It deserves understanding. It deserves to be remembered. If this is already changing the way you see the ancient world, leave a comment right now with the words, "I never knew Jerusalem was like this." Let us see how many of you are as stunned as we were when we first uncovered these facts. Here is where the story turns strange. Here is where the logic breaks down and the great paradox of Roman sanitation reveals itself in full. The Romans were, by any measure, the most sanitation-conscious civilization the ancient world had ever produced. They built public latrines with multiple stone seats arranged side by side, flushed by a continuous stream of water recycled from the public baths. They constructed sewer networks so advanced that the Cloaca Maxima in Rome, first built around 500 years before the Common Era, is still partially functional today. They engineered aqueducts that would not be surpassed in their capacity to deliver clean water until the 18th and 19th centuries, when cities like London and Paris finally caught up. They passed sanitation laws requiring the removal of waste from urban streets. They built public bathhouses in every significant settlement across their empire. They even had deities dedicated to sewage. The goddess Cloacina protected the great sewer of Rome. The god Crepitus was invoked for flatulence and digestive complaints. Sterquilinus, whose name derives from the Latin word for excrement, was revered by farmers who used human waste as fertilizer. And yet, despite all of this, a landmark 2016 study by Dr. Piers Mitchell of Cambridge University revealed something that stunned the archaeological world. After compiling parasite evidence from Roman-era latrines, burial sites, and fossilized feces across the entire empire, Mitchell found that intestinal parasites like whipworm, roundworm, and the amoeba that causes dysentery did not decrease under Roman rule compared to the preceding Iron Age. They increased. The Romans built toilets and people got sicker. They piped clean water and infections spread further. They mandated hygiene and parasites thrived. How was this possible? The answer lies in the details that no triumphal arch ever commemorated. First, the public baths, those gleaming temples of cleanliness, were in practice enormous petri dishes. The water in most bathhouses was changed only once a day, if that. There were no filtration systems, no chlorine, no antimicrobial agents of any kind. Whatever bacteria, fungi, or parasites washed off one person's body remained in the water for hours, waiting for the next bather. Roman physicians routinely prescribed time in the hot baths as treatment for illness, which meant that diseased and healthy citizens often bathed in the same waters. The sick preferred to visit in the afternoon or evening, but by the next morning, the pathogens they had shed were still alive, floating invisibly in the warm pools where healthy people came to start their day. Second, and perhaps more critically, the Romans used human excrement as agricultural fertilizer. This was not negligence, it was standard practice, endorsed by agricultural writers and considered economically essential. Roman authors described carefully positioning cesspit latrines on country estates for easy access to the gardens. The waste collected from urban latrines was carted out of the cities, exactly as the sanitation laws demanded, and spread directly onto the fields where food was growing. This created a devastating cycle of reinfection. Parasite eggs are extraordinarily hardy. They can survive in soil for months or even years. The crops grown in feces-enriched earth carried those eggs straight to the marketplace, straight to the kitchen, straight to the plate. The very law that removed waste from the streets may have been the mechanism that put it into the food. Third, there was garum. This was the Romans' beloved fermented fish sauce, a condiment so ubiquitous across the empire that it appeared in nearly every recipe in the Roman cookbook attributed to Apicius. Garum was made by layering fish intestines, small whole fish, salt and herbs in large stone vats, then leaving the mixture to ferment in the sun for weeks. It was never cooked. It was traded in sealed jars across the entire Mediterranean, from the factories of Spain and North Africa to the tables of Jerusalem. The Roman philosopher Seneca described it as a putrid, bloody mass of decayed fish. But Romans consumed it obsessively. The problem, as Mitchell's research revealed, is that fish tapeworm parasites, which had been relatively rare in Bronze and Iron Age Europe, became far more widespread during the Roman period. The fermentation of garum did nothing to kill tapeworm eggs. Because the sauce was never heated, and because it was distributed across thousands of kilometers of trade routes, garum may have acted as one of the most efficient vectors for parasitic infection in the ancient world. The flavor that defined Roman cuisine was quietly spreading disease from one end of the empire to the other. In Jerusalem, where Roman culinary habits mixed with Jewish dietary traditions, and where the constant influx of pilgrims from every province created a microbial melting pot, these factors converged with devastating effect. The public baths that the Romans introduced brought comfort, but also contagion. The waste removal systems brought cleaner streets, but dirtier food. And the beloved fish sauce brought flavor, but also tapeworms. If this documentary is opening your eyes to a history you never learned in school, hit that like button right now. It helps more people discover the truth behind the ancient world. There is one more layer to this story, and it is perhaps the most unexpected of all, because in Jerusalem, sanitation was not merely a practical problem, it was a theological one. The way a person handled their own body's waste was, in this city more than any other, a direct reflection of their relationship with the divine. The Torah, the foundation of Jewish law, contained explicit instructions about the management of human waste. The book of Deuteronomy commanded the Israelites to designate a place outside the camp for relieving themselves, and to carry a paddle or shovel to dig a hole and cover the waste afterward. This was not framed as health advice, it was framed as holiness. The text states that God walks among the camp, and therefore the camp must be kept clean, so that God sees nothing indecent and turns away. In ancient Jerusalem, this meant that the handling of excrement was governed by the same legal and religious framework that governed prayer, sacrifice, and worship. The stakes were not merely physical, they were cosmic. No group in the ancient world took these commandments more seriously than the Essenes, a strict Jewish sect that flourished in the 1st century and is widely believed to have produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, found at Qumran, near the shores of the Dead Sea. The scrolls contain astonishingly detailed instructions about where and how members were to relieve themselves. The temple scroll specified that latrines had to be built outside the city to the northwest, with roofed outhouses positioned over pits so that no waste was visible from the settlement. The war scroll required a distance of at least 2,000 cubits, roughly 1 kilometer, between the community camp and the latrine area. The 1st century historian Josephus, who wrote admiringly about the Essenes, noted that they carried small hatchets specifically for digging toilet trenches, and that they covered themselves entirely with their robes while defecating so that they would not offend God's sight. Most remarkably, Josephus reported that the Essenes refused to use the toilet on the Sabbath because the latrine was farther away than the distance a Jew was permitted to walk on the holy day. They held it in for 24 hours as an act of religious devotion. In 2006, an international research team led by Israeli anthropologist Joe Zias and biblical scholar James Tabor from the University of North Carolina set out to find the actual latrine used by the Qumran community. Following the specific directional instructions preserved in the scrolls, they identified a flat area approximately 500 meters northwest of the ruins, sheltered from view behind a natural rock formation. Soil samples from the site were analyzed by French parasitologist Stéphanie Harter-Lailhugue, who confirmed the presence of preserved eggs from 3 species of human intestinal parasites. The desert conditions at Qumran, combined with the Essenes' practice of burying their waste, had paradoxically preserved the parasites instead of destroying them. The very act of pious covering had created an incubation chamber. Because the eggs were sealed beneath soil, rather than exposed to the sun and dry desert air, they survived and accumulated, creating a contaminated zone that members of the community walked through repeatedly. The men buried at Qumran Cemetery had an average age at death of just 34 years. While many factors contributed to this early mortality, the researchers suggested that the latrine's unsanitary conditions, combined with the community's practice of ritual bathing in stagnant pools after visiting the toilet, likely played a significant role in spreading infectious disease among the members. This finding carries a profound and uncomfortable irony. The people who tried hardest to be clean before God, who walked the farthest, who dug the deepest, who covered the most carefully, who refused to pollute their sacred space with the impurities of the body, were among the sickest communities in the region. Their devotion to purity became a mechanism of disease. Their obedience to divine sanitation law, interpreted with absolute literalism, created conditions that modern epidemiology would recognize as dangerously unsanitary. And in the city of Jerusalem itself, the broader Jewish community followed its own purity laws with dedication. Ritual hand-washing was required before and after meals, before worship, after visiting a cemetery, after sleeping, after touching certain objects. The laws of Leviticus mandated the isolation of anyone with certain skin conditions, the laundering of contaminated clothing, and the purification of anyone who had touched a corpse. These practices, historians have noted, may help explain why mortality rates among Jewish communities in later centuries, particularly during the Great Plagues of medieval Europe, were significantly lower than among their neighbors. The ritual discipline of cleanliness, passed down through millennia, provided a measure of protection even when no one understood the biological reasons why. But in the first century, that protection had limits. No amount of hand-washing could purify a water supply contaminated with giardia. No ritual bath could kill the roundworm eggs in soil fertilized with human waste. No prayer could stop the dysentery that spread through flies landing on uncovered food in a crowded market. The people of Jerusalem were caught between what their laws told them to do and what their environment made inevitable. They were, in the most literal sense, doing their best. If this story is hitting differently than you expected, share this documentary with someone who loves history. Sometimes the most powerful truths are the ones we never thought to look for. There is something extraordinary about a cesspit. It is perhaps the most honest artifact any civilization can leave behind. A temple tells you what people aspired to be, a palace tells you what they wanted others to see, a tomb tells you how they wished to be remembered, but a cesspit tells you the truth. It tells you what people ate, what parasites lived inside them, what diseases they suffered, what medicines they tried, what they could not escape no matter how wealthy or powerful or devout they were. The cesspits of ancient Jerusalem are among the most eloquent witnesses to the reality of life under Roman rule. When archaeologists examined the contents of the cesspit beneath the luxury toilet at Armon Hanatziv, that 7th century estate with its exquisite carved stone capitals and its garden of ornamental trees, they did not find the remains of a healthy household. They found roundworm, a parasite that can grow to 30 centimeters inside the human intestine and causes abdominal pain, malnutrition, and developmental delays in children. They found whipworm, which burrows into the lining of the large intestine and feeds on blood, causing chronic diarrhea and anemia. They found tapeworm transmitted through undercooked beef or pork, which can grow to several meters inside the body and rob the host of nutrients for years. And they found pinworm, a parasite so contagious that it spreads through airborne transmission of its microscopic eggs, causing intense itching and insomnia. Dr. Langut, who led the study, noted that these parasites still exist today, but the modern world has developed diagnostic tools and medications to prevent epidemics. In ancient Jerusalem, recovery from intestinal worms was difficult and often impossible. Those infected could suffer from the parasites for the rest of their lives. What makes this finding even more striking is its implications for the broader population. If the richest residents of Jerusalem, the ones with private toilets and walled estates and gardens, were this heavily parasitized, what was the condition of the poor, the laborers who drank from public fountains, the pilgrims who camped in open fields outside the walls during festivals, the children who played in streets where waste was dumped from windows? The archaeological record cannot give us a complete answer, but the logic is inescapable. The parasites found in the cesspits of the wealthy represent a minimum baseline of infection. The reality for the majority was almost certainly far worse. And this was not unique to Jerusalem. Across the Roman Empire, from Britain to North Africa, from the Danube frontier to the cities of Anatolia, the same pattern has emerged. 12 species of internal parasites and 5 species of external parasites have been positively identified at Roman period archaeological sites. Fleas, head lice, body lice, pubic lice, and bedbugs were so common that archaeologists have found specialized, fine-toothed combs designed specifically for stripping lice from hair. Delousing may have been a daily routine for most people living anywhere in the empire. The famous Roman culture of regular bathing in public bathhouses did absolutely nothing to reduce the prevalence of these parasites. The evidence, compiled across dozens of excavations, fails to demonstrate any health benefit from the bathing practices that Rome considered the very foundation of civilized life. You are now standing at the end of a long corridor of time, looking back at a world that was simultaneously more sophisticated and more vulnerable than most people imagine. The Romans built systems that would not be matched for over 1,000 years. They moved water across mountains and through tunnels with mathematical precision. They created public spaces for communal cleanliness that have no parallel until the modern era. And yet their people carried parasites in their guts, lice in their hair, and diseases in their blood at rates no better and sometimes worse than the societies they conquered. The paradox is not that they failed. The paradox is that they tried so hard and understood so little. They could engineer the flow of water across 40 kilometers of terrain, but could not see the organism living in a drop of it. They could build a sewer to carry waste out of a city, but could not grasp why spreading that waste on their fields made them sick. They could mandate cleanliness by law, but could not legislate the invisible biology that mocked every effort. And in Jerusalem, all of these contradictions were amplified by the unique pressures of a sacred city under foreign occupation. The population surges during festivals, the tension between Jewish purity laws and Roman sanitation practices, the political violence that accompanied even the most beneficial infrastructure projects, the theological weight placed on the human body and its functions, the desperate improvisation of ordinary people trying to stay alive in a city that was simultaneously one of the most important places on earth and one of the most challenging to inhabit. What the cesspits remember is not failure. They remember life. Messy, difficult, resilient, stubborn, miraculous life. They remember that human beings have always found ways to carry on in conditions that seem impossible, that civilization has always been built on foundations that are far more fragile than the monuments suggest, and that the distance between greatness and collapse is often measured not in armies or treaties, but in water quality and waste management. The cesspits of Jerusalem remember what the temples forgot, that survival itself is the most fundamental act of devotion. Confira se já é inscrito neste canal. If this documentary changed the way you think about the ancient world, make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss what comes next. We bring you the stories that textbooks leave out every single week. Se você assistiu até aqui é porque gostou desse caso. Deixe um comentário dizendo "Eu assisti até aqui", para que eu possa te conhecer e saber quem realmente gosta das histórias aqui do canal. Leave your like on this video. It is the simplest gesture, but it is what tells us to keep digging, keep researching, keep bringing you the truth behind the ancient world, and share this documentary with a friend, a student, a fellow lover of history. Some stories are too important to keep to yourself. Until next time.